In the shadow of the ancient hills where the mist clung like a shroud to the twisted pines, Eliza Harlan sat alone in her creaky cabin, the glow of her laptop screen casting eerie patterns across the weathered walls. The package had arrived without warning, a sleek box promising to unlock the mysteries of her bloodline, and she'd swabbed her cheek with a mix of boredom and faint curiosity, mailing it off into the void. Weeks later, the email chimed in the dead of night, pulling her from a restless sleep haunted by half-remembered dreams of faces too familiar, eyes staring back from the mirror with an unnatural gleam. The results loaded slowly, each percentage ticking like a countdown to some unspoken doom, traces of distant shores, whispers of forgotten peoples, but woven through it all, a knot of connections so tight it choked the family tree. Matches upon matches, cousins who were siblings in disguise, aunts and uncles looping back in ways that defied the natural order. The word Melungeon leaped from the footnotes like a curse, evoking tales she'd heard as a child, ghost stories of shadow dwellers in the hollows, their skin marked by secrets, their unions bound by necessity and fear. As the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin door, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay, Eliza felt the first shiver of something awakening, a legacy buried for a century and a half, now clawing its way to the surface, hungry for reckoning. The autumn rain had been falling for 3 straight days when the package appeared on Eliza Harlan's porch, wrapped in plain brown paper and bearing no return address. She almost left it there. The mailman never came this far up the ridge unless something was urgent, and nothing urgent ever happened in Black Hollow. But the box was light, almost weightless, and the tape sealing it had been applied with a precision that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. She carried it inside, past the wood stove that never quite warmed the corners of the cabin, and set it on the scarred pine table her grandfather had built with his own trembling hands. The label read only her name, handwritten in ink that had bled slightly in the damp. No postage marks, no barcode. Someone had walked it up the gravel switchbacks and left it like an offering. Eliza turned the box over twice, listening for a rattle that never came, then fetched her pocket knife. The paper peeled away easily, revealing a glossy white kit from one of those Ancestry companies that advertised on late-night television, smiling families discovering Viking blood or lost Sephardic roots. A plastic vial, a prepaid envelope, instructions folded so crisply they crackled. Someone, somewhere, wanted her to spit into a tube and mail her past to strangers. She almost threw it in the stove. Harlan women didn't go digging in graveyards they hadn't been invited to. But the rain kept hammering the tin roof, the power flickered, and boredom settled over her like a second skin. She'd spent 34 years in this same holler, watching cousins marry cousins of cousins until the family tree looked less like branches and more like a tangled briar patch. What harm could a little science do? She uncapped the vial, worked up the saliva, sealed it, and dropped the envelope in the rusted mailbox at the foot of the ridge the next morning, half expecting the forest to swallow it whole before it ever reached a lab. She forgot about it for weeks. Then, on a night when the wind sounded like voices arguing just beyond the tree line, the results arrived. The email came at 2:17 a.m., the exact minute the old wall clock in the kitchen stopped ticking for no reason Eliza could ever explain later. She was awake anyway, sitting wrapped in a quilt that smelled of cedar and her grandmother's pipe tobacco, scrolling mindlessly through grainy photos of people she half recognized from funerals. The subject line was innocuous, "Your ancestry results are ready," but the preview thumbnail showed a chromosome map so densely clustered it looked bruised. She clicked. The first page loaded with the usual pie chart of ethnicities, a sliver of Iberian, a darker wedge labeled Sub-Saharan African, a stubborn block of broadly Northwestern European, and then a grey haze marked unassigned. Nothing shocking for someone raised on whispers of Portuguese sailors or Cherokee great-great-grandmothers who vanished from the census. It was the second tab that made the room tilt. DNA matches. Normally these lists were sprinkled with fifth cousins and shirt-tail relations scattered across Ohio or Tennessee. Hers was different. The top 50 matches all shared variations of the same 3 surnames, Harlan, Riddle, and Goins. Every single one. Their profile pictures, where they existed, showed the same high cheekbones, the same pale eyes set a fraction too close, the same thin, determined mouths. Predicted relationships didn't branch outward the way they were supposed to, they folded inward like the pleats of an accordion. A woman listed as second to third cousin shared 1,412 centimorgans, more than most full siblings. Another, flagged simply as close family, turned out to be a first cousin once removed who also registered as a half-niece. The tree the website tried to draw for her looked less like genealogy and more like a Celtic knot drawn by a madman. Eliza's breath fogged the screen. She clicked deeper, past the polite warnings about pedigree collapse and endogamy, past the sterile little footnotes explaining that some populations marry within tight circles for cultural reasons. The raw data dump was worse. Long runs of homozygosity, stretches where both her chromosomes were identical, not just similar, identical, as if copied and pasted across generations. The lab's own note, tucked at the bottom in pale grey text, read almost apologetic: extremely high coefficient of inbreeding detected, F greater than or equal to 0.17. Results may reflect multiple loops of common ancestry within the past 5 to 7 generations. Outside, something heavy moved through the laurel thicket, slow and deliberate, as though the mountain itself had leaned in to read over her shoulder. The screen's cold glow kept her pinned to the chair long after the wood stove burned down to embers. Eliza's fingers moved without permission now, opening new tabs, chasing hyperlinks the way her granddaddy once chased Farksfi through the dark. She typed the surnames first, Harlan Riddlegoynes, then the words the report had spat out like stones: endogamy, pedigree collapse, runs of homozygosity. The results poured in: forum threads from the early 2000s, scanned newspaper clippings, grainy message boards where people argued in the clipped, defensive dialect she still heard at family reunions. That was when the word appeared, glowing on a dozen pages at once: Melungeon. She had heard it before, always as a slur hissed across a grade school playground or muttered by outsiders who thought the ridge people looked different. Swarthy, they called them. Portuguese-looking. Sometimes worse. Her mother had slapped the word out of anyone's mouth who dared use it in the house, same as she'd slap out trash or bastard. But here it was, resurrected in academic papers and breathless blogs, spelled out like a diagnosis. They were a people without a country, the articles claimed, triracial isolates who appeared in the Appalachian records around 1800 and then tried to vanish. Tax rolls marked them FPC, free persons of color, 1 year, white the next, mulatto when it suited the clerk. They lived in ridges no census taker wanted to climb, married only each other, spoken English so old it sounded like Shakespeare gargling moonshine. Some said they were descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors and Saponi women. Others swore they carried the blood of lost Roanoke colonists, or escaped Moorish slaves, or even the brass-ankled remnants of Carthaginian explorers. Every theory contradicted the last, and every theory ended the same way. After the Civil War, when being anything but white became dangerous, the Melungeons closed ranks, moved higher into the Laurel Hells, and began marrying cousins so often the outside world forgot they existed at all. Eliza scrolled until the words blurred. Old photographs loaded slowly, men with olive skin and straight black hair staring at the camera like they already knew they'd be erased, women with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and eyes the color of creek ice. She recognized the slope of a forehead here, the set of a jaw there. One woman, photographed in 1938 beside a split-rail fence, could have been Eliza's own reflection if the picture had been taken yesterday. A notification pinged. Someone with the username Melungeon87 had viewed her public tree. Their profile picture was black, their location listed only as ridge above Black Hollow. The little green dot beside their name pulsed like a heartbeat. They were online right now, watching. The next morning the sky hung low and yellow, the color of old bruises, and Eliza knew she wouldn't rest until someone who still carried the old tongue said the word out loud. She drove the rutted track to Aunt Aurelie's place, a tar-papered house crouched at the head of Rock Hollow where even cell signals went to die. Aurelie was 93, maybe 97, nobody had ever settled the year, and she wasn't telling. She sat on the porch in a cane-bottom rocker, skin so thin the blue veins mapped whole counties beneath it, eyes filmed white but sharp as a hawk's. Eliza set a jar of blackberry jam on the rail, the toll for any visit, and asked, plain as creek water, what the test had said about the blood running double. Aurelie didn't flinch. She just rocked, the chair creaking like old bones, and stared at the ridge where the fog moved slow between the pines like it was looking for something it had lost. Child, she finally rasped, voice dry as corn shucks, you don't ask about the rope in a house where a man's hanged hisself. But Eliza waited, the way you wait on a storm. Aurelie spat a stream of tobacco juice the color of rust, wiped her mouth with the back of a hand knotted like hickory roots, and leaned forward. Your great-grandma Virgie used to say we kept the blood clean the way some folks keep the fire banked. Feed it just enough kin to keep it from goin' out altogether. Outsiders brung sickness, brung questions, brung the law. Inside the ridge we knowed who we was, even when the Flatlanders called us Portuguese, called us worse. Virgie married her daddy's brother's boy. Her young uns married first cousins. Wasn't lust, wasn't even love half the time. Was covenant. She paused, rocking slower now, the chair's rhythm matching the pulse Eliza felt in her throat. They said if the blood got too thin, the old marks would fade. The 6 fingers, the shovel teeth, the ridge down the back that some was born with. Said if we let strangers in, the secret would spill out and the world would come with torches like it done before. So we married who we knowed, and we buried what wouldn't keep quiet. Aurelie's blind eyes fixed on Eliza's face as if she could see straight through to the marrow. You done opened the book, gal. Some books bite when you turn the page. The rain started again that night, a hard mountain rain that sounded like thrown gravel against the tin roof. Eliza couldn't sleep. Aurelie's words had burrowed under her skin and nested there, twitching every time she closed her eyes. Around 3, she found herself in the attic crawlspace she hadn't entered since she was 12, kneeling among mouse-chewed quilts and boxes of photographs curled like dead leaves. She was hunting the one thing Aurelie had refused to name, the big family Bible her great-grandmother Virgie used to thump like a drum whenever sin was mentioned. She found it wedged behind a stack of yellowed army discharge papers, heavier than memory. The leather cover had gone soft and dark with generations of hands, the gilt title almost worn away. When she carried it down to the kitchen table and opened it under the single bulb, the smell that rose was equal parts mildew and old blood. The front pages were as expected, marriages and deaths recorded in brown ink that had feathered over decades. But the family register, those center leaves meant for births, had been attacked. Someone long ago had taken a straight razor to the paper. Names were sliced out so cleanly only ghosts of letters remained. Where a mother's maiden name should have been, only ragged holes. Where dates of birth belonged, someone had scrawled strange sigils in faded red, symbols that looked half Christian, half something older. A 6-point star inside a circle, a crooked cross with an extra arm, tiny hand-drawn eyes that stared up from the margins. Eliza tilted the book. In the hollows left by the razor, she could feel faint ridges, raised scars where another hand had pressed too hard with a pen, writing over what had been erased. She fetched her phone, turned on the flashlight, and held it flat. Shadows filled the gouges and revealed the truth. Every excised name had been replaced underneath with the same surname, over and over, like a chant. Harlan. 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 Sometimes Riddle or Goines, but always looping back, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, the tree folding in on itself until the branches strangled the trunk. On the last intact page, in a child's uneven copperplate, someone had written a single line dated 1894, "Let no stranger read these names lest the mountain take its due." The bulb flickered once, as though the house itself had drawn a warning breath. Sleep finally took her just before dawn, but it wasn't rest. It was a slow drowning. She stood barefoot on the ridge behind the cabin, fog thick as wool around her ankles. The pines had been replaced by people, hundreds of them, lined shoulder to shoulder along the spine of the mountain. They wore the clothes of every decade she'd ever seen in photographs, feed-sack dresses, wool suits with elbow patches, overalls faded almost white, a few in nothing but homespun shifts. Every face was a variation of hers. Same narrow nose, same pale irises ringed in darker blue, same mouth that looked ready to speak a secret or bite. They didn't move at first. They only watched, heads tilted at the exact same angle, the way dogs do when they hear a sound too high for human ears. Then the nearest one, a boy no older than 10 with a ridge of extra cartilage along the crown of his skull, lifted a hand that ended in 6 thin fingers and beckoned. Eliza tried to step back and found the ground soft, sucking at her heels like fresh tar. The line advanced 1 shuffle. Their eyes were wrong, too large, too glossy, reflecting the weak moonlight like animals caught on a game camera. When they opened their mouths, no sound came, only the wet click of teeth that weren't quite aligned. She saw the shovel-shaped incisors the articles had mentioned, the extra cusp on every molar, the faint blue cast to skin that had never seen much sun. Another step. The smell reached her now, damp earth, copper, the sweet rot of ginseng left too long in a jar. She turned to run and slammed into more of them behind her. A woman who could have been Aureli 60 years ago cupped Eliza's face with cold palms and leaned close enough that Eliza felt the breath that wasn't there. "You brung the light in," the woman whispered, voice layered, as though every ancestor spoke at once. "Now we can all see what we are." Hands slid over her arms, her throat, gentle but unbreakable. Fingers traced the veins at her wrists like reading braille. Somewhere in the press of bodies she felt a child's mouth close on her earlobe, not biting, only holding, tasting the salt of her fear. She woke gasping, sheets twisted so tight around her legs she had to claw them loose. The bedroom was empty, the only sound the rain still rattling the gutters. But when she stumbled to the mirror, the reflection that stared back had eyes a shade too wide, pupils blown black, and for one heartbeat the face wasn't entirely her own. 2 days later Eliza drove down off the ridge, past the last mailbox and the last pretense of pavement, until the road turned to red clay and the county library appeared like a bunker half swallowed by kudzu. Miss Arbutus, the librarian since Nixon was president, watched her come in soaked and shaking and didn't ask questions. She simply slid a key across the counter for the local history room nobody used anymore. The room smelled of coal dust and desperation. Eliza spent hours pulling down ring binders no one had cracked since the bicentennial. Clinch Valley Genealogical Quarterly, 1987. A dog-eared thesis from East Tennessee State titled Melungeon Endogamy and the Persistence of Cryptic Communities. Hand-drawn maps showing settlements that had no names on any official survey. Each source told the same story in different degrees of shame. After the 1840s, when Tennessee started taxing free persons of color out of existence and Virginia passed laws against mongrel marriages, the Melungeons did what any cornered animal does: they vanished upward. Whole families packed mules in the night and followed deer trails to places the sheriffs wouldn't ride. Newman's Ridge, Blackwater, Stone Mountain, Vardy, places where winter came early and left late. They built cabins in laurel slicks so thick a man could hide 10 feet off the trace and never be seen. They told outsiders they were Portuguese, or Cherokee, or just old settlers, anything to keep the revenue man or the clan from riding in. But isolation has a price. By 1900 the ridges were full of children with the same last names and the same strange beauty, the same anomalies: polydactyly, anomalous dentition, hearts that beat on the wrong side. Marrying out meant leaving the mountain forever, and few did. The church rolls, when preachers dared climb that high, recorded unions that made the circuit riders blanch: a man and his deceased wife's sister, a girl of 15 and her mother's first cousin, a widow and the half-brother she'd grown up calling uncle. The elders called it keeping the old ways pure. Everyone else called it survival. One photograph, glued crookedly into a 1939 WPA report, showed 37 people posed on the steps of a one-room school. 37 faces, maybe 8 surnames total. The caption, typed on a manual machine, read simply, "Melungeon Children, Hancock County, Tennessee." Note uniformity of features. Eliza stared until the faces swam. She recognized the porch rails, the dog lying underneath. It was the old schoolhouse 3 hollows over, the one that burned in '62. She had played in its foundation as a child, never knowing the stones had once held her ghosts together. When she looked up, the windows had gone dark with evening and Miss Arbutus was locking the front door, leaving her alone with the dead who had never really left. The raw data file from the testing company sat unopened for another week, a 40-megabyte bomb in her downloads folder. Eliza told herself she was done digging, but every night the cursor drifted back to it like a tongue to a sore tooth. Finally, on a night when the power kept browning out and the cabin filled with the ozone smell of distant lightning, she double-clicked. The file opened into columns of numbers that meant nothing until she fed them into an open-source genealogy program someone on a Melungeon forum swore by. 30 minutes later the screen redrawed her tree in brutal clarity, every loop and knot rendered in red. One branch shot backward like an arrow, straight through her grandmother, her great-grandmother Veggie, her great-great-grandfather Enoch Harlan, and then, impossibly clean, to a man born 1823 in a place the census listed only as Snake Hollow, Lee County, Virginia. Silas Devil Cy Harlan. The name hit her like cold water. Every Ridge child knew the stories: the preacher with the black-bound book who could make fire jump from his palm, who healed a dying horse with a whisper and cursed a revenue man so his tongue swelled black. They said he took no wife but fathered children on 3 sisters who all carried his surname already. They said when he died in 1897 the ground wouldn't have him. The coffin had to be weighted with creek stones and sunk in an unnamed branch. The program flagged Silas as her direct ancestor 5 generations back. No gaps, no ambiguity. Then it did something worse. It overlaid his known descendants, hundreds of them, across modern testing databases and lit up like a Christmas tree. Half the close matches she'd puzzled over were his great-grandchildren. The inbreeding coefficient wasn't an accident of geography. It was engineered, a deliberate spiral designed to concentrate whatever Silas had carried in his blood. A second file auto-downloaded with the results. An old newspaper scan the company had attached as historical context. The headline was faded but legible: Mountain sorcerer dies howling, family refuses Christian burial. Beneath it, a woodcut showed a tall man with a hawk nose and eyes like winter ponds. The face was unmistakable. She saw it every time she passed the mirror. Thunder rolled directly overhead, close enough to rattle the nails in the walls. In the blue-white flash she could have sworn the silhouette of a man stood just outside the window, tall hat dripping rain, watching her with the same eyes that now stared back from her own skull. The first sign was Cousin Raylene's boy, little Boone, just turned 7. He'd always been small, but now his collarbones stuck out like coat hangers and his skin had gone the color of weak tea. The doctors down in Kingsport called it failure to thrive and sent him home with vitamin drops. 2 weeks later Raylene found him blue in his crib, eyes open wide like he'd seen something coming around the corner that nobody else could. They buried him in the family plot behind the church nobody attended anymore. Then it was Aunt Delphia, who'd bragged her whole life about never being sick a day. She woke one morning with a mouth full of blood and teeth that cracked like burnt sugar when the dentist tried to pull them. The gums never healed, they just kept weeping, slow and steady, until she lost 30 pounds in a month and her breath smelled like turned earth. She told Lorelei it felt like something inside was eating its way out, patient as a tapeworm. Eliza started keeping a list on the back of an envelope: Raylene's boy, Aunt Delphia, Uncle Finch who went blind overnight, second cousin Mothy whose joints swelled so bad she couldn't hold a teacup anymore. All of them carried the same surnames that crowded her DNA matches. All of them born and raised within a 10-mile radius of Black Hollow. The old folks had a name for it: the wasting. They'd whisper it the way Flatlanders said cancer, like saying it too loud might invite it in for supper. She found the term in a 1930s medical journal someone had scanned and uploaded to an obscure archive. A University of Virginia doctor had spent a summer in Hancock County cataloging congenital anomalies among the Melungeon population. His notes read like horror: osteogenesis imperfecta, Ehlers-Danlos, rare hemoglobinopanos, dental enamel hyperplasia, situs inversus, polydactyly corrected with pocket knives at birth. He blamed consanguinity, wrote the word in Latin like it might be less ugly that way. The families, he said, refused outside marriages and punished anyone who tried to leave with shunning so complete it was worse than death. Eliza read until the words crawled. Every condition he listed had appeared in her own extended family at least once, dismissed as bad luck or the will of God. The wasting wasn't a curse from Devil Cy Harlan, it was compound interest on a century and a half of the same blood chasing itself in circles. She looked up from the screen and saw her own hands trembling, the knuckles already beginning to swell the way Mothis had. The morning after she noticed the swelling in her own knuckles, 3 trucks pulled up the hollow before the sun had cleared the ridge. Black Harlans, Riddle cousins, 2 Goins brothers she hadn't seen since her daddy's funeral. They came quiet, no slamming doors, no greetings, just the slow crunch of gravel under boots that knew every rock on the road. Lorelei was with them, wrapped in a quilt despite the heat, eyes wrapped in gauze because the light had started hurting her last winter. They filled the cabin like smoke, settling on chairs, on the hearth, on the floor, until the air itself felt thick enough to chew. Nobody spoke until Lorelei lifted one trembling hand and pointed at the laptop still open on the table, the screen dark but accusing. "We know what you found," she said, voice soft as grave dirt. "We all got the same letter from that company. Same numbers. Same devil face staring back. Eliza tried to stand and found her knees wouldn't hold. Cousin Gideon, 6'4" and silent as a cedar, placed a hand on her shoulder and pressed her gently back into the chair. On the table someone laid a single sheet of paper, thick as parchment, covered in handwriting she recognized from the Bible's margins. A covenant, dated 1897, the year Silas Harlan supposedly clawed his way out of the ground and had to be sunk again. 43 names in iron gall ink, every head of household then living on the ridge. Beneath the names, a single paragraph. We the undersigned do solemnly swear to keep the blood entire, to marry only within the old families, to suffer no stranger to read the book of our generations, and to silence by whatever means required any among us who would break the circle and bring the world's eyes upon us again. So sworn before God and the mountain. At the bottom, in fresh blue ballpoint, new signatures had been added over the years, the ink still bright. Her own mother's name, 1983. Raylene's shaky scrawl, 2001. And at the very end, blank space waiting. Aurelie reached into her apron and drew out a fountain pen older than any of them, the kind that still used real ink you had to suck up through the nib. She laid it on the covenant like a loaded gun. Your turn, Eliza June, she said. Sign, and we burn every copy, every file, every lying screen. We go back to keeping quiet, same as always. Or don't, and we do what was done to your great-uncle Lemuel when he threatened to talk to that writer from Knoxville. The room waited, breath held, while outside the crows started up a racket that sounded almost human.